Three men had her cornered in the dark. No cameras, no bodyguards, no witnesses. Just cold concrete, shadows, and the kind of silence that meant nobody was coming to help. She had money, more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and it meant absolutely nothing in that moment. Then a voice cut through the dark. Calm. No shouting, no threats. Just a few quiet words that made all three men go very, very still. Nobody knew who he was. A mechanic, a single dad, the most dangerous man in that parking lot, and the last person anyone expected. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification. I put out stories like this every week, stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but ordinary. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it, because this story, it starts long before that parking lot. The thing about Blackridge was that it was the kind of town you pass through without meaning to stop. 2 traffic lights, 1 diner that smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup, no matter what time of day you walked in. A hardware store that had been there since the 1970s and still had the same hand-painted sign out front. A small marina where the older men went on Saturday mornings, not really to fish, just to sit and not be asked about their feelings. It was a quiet place. The kind of quiet that either healed you or slowly drove you out of your mind, depending on what you were carrying when you arrived. Ethan Vale had arrived 7 years ago carrying plenty. He drove into Blackridge in a used truck with a car seat in the back and a duffel bag that didn't have much in it. He paid 3 months' rent up front in cash on a small house on Meridian Street, the kind of house where the porch steps creaked and the hot water took a minute to decide if it was coming or not. The landlord, a retired postal worker named Gerald, asked him where he'd come from. South, Ethan said. Gerald waited for more. He didn't get any. That was pretty much how every conversation with Ethan Vale went in those early years. Not rude, not cold, just precise. He said what was necessary and nothing else. The people of Blackridge eventually stopped trying to pull more out of him. Some people were just built that way, they figured. Quiet men weren't unusual in a town like this. He bought the old Calvert garage on Route 9 with money that nobody asked where he got it. Fixed the lift himself, repainted the bay doors a dark green that looked almost black in the rain, and hung a hand-stenciled sign above the entrance. Vale Auto. Nothing else. No tagline, no promises about customer satisfaction. Just a name. Within a year, people were driving 40 minutes out of their way to bring their vehicles to him. He was good with engines. Really good. Not just good in the way where you can change an oil filter and swap out brake pads. Good in the way where he could stand beside a running vehicle, close his eyes, listen for maybe 10 seconds, and tell you what was wrong. Harold Pemberton, who ran the town council, said it was the damnedest thing he'd ever seen. Said Ethan listened to machines the way a doctor listened to a chest. But what made people keep coming back wasn't just the mechanical skill, it was the honesty. There was a woman, Ruth Ann Gable, who came in one October convinced she needed a new transmission. She'd been told as much by a shop over in Carver County. Ethan looked at the car, drove it around the block once, and came back and told her it was a sensor. $40 part. Took him 20 minutes to fix. He charged her for the part and 1 hour of labor. She cried a little, right there in the bay. He handed her a paper towel and told her the car would be fine. That story spread the way good stories do in small towns. Slowly, person to person, the details staying accurate because the truth was remarkable enough without any embellishment. People trusted him. Not because he asked them to, because he never once gave them a reason not to. His daughter's name was Mia, and she was 8 years old, and she was, there's no other word for it, a handful. Not in a bad way. In the way where she had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and a laugh that was too loud for her small body, and she had decided somewhere around the age of 6 that she was going to be a marine biologist. Ethan did not know where this decision had come from. There was no ocean near Blackridge. There were no aquariums. There was one library that had a modest science section and a documentary about sharks that Mia had watched so many times the DVD was starting to skip. But she had decided, and so it was decided. That was Mia. She would sit at the metal stool next to the tool bench while he worked, homework spread across the surface, pencil behind her ear, asking questions constantly. Dad, what's a carburetor actually do? Mixes air and fuel. Why does it have to mix them? Because the engine needs both to run. Why can't it just run on air? He handed her back a wrench she'd knocked off the bench. Nothing good runs on air alone. She considered this with the seriousness of someone 3 times her age. Then, is that a metaphor? It's a fact about internal combustion engines. I think it might also be a metaphor. He looked at her over his shoulder, and there was something in his face then, not quite a smile, but the shape that came just before one, the thing that happened in the corners of his eyes. Finish your homework, he said. She did, eventually. Those evenings in the garage, those were the good ones, the ones Ethan held on to, the ones that made the rest of it worth carrying. What the people of Blackridge didn't know about Ethan Vale, and what Ethan Vale had worked carefully to make sure they didn't know, was that the quiet mechanic on Route 9 had once been something else entirely. He had been a United States Navy SEAL, not the kind that wears the uniform to parades and gets his picture taken. The other kind. The kind that operated in places that didn't appear on news reports. The kind whose work was measured in outcomes rather than headlines. He'd been part of a specialized unit that handled what his commanding officer used to call problems that couldn't wait for paperwork. He'd enlisted at 21, was screened for Bullies at 23, failed the first pool competency test because of a cramp in his left calf and spent the next 6 months in a rage about it. Came back. Passed. Went through Hell Week twice, the first time he was rolled due to a shoulder injury, the second time he finished, barely standing, but finished. His instructor, a chief petty officer named Briggs, who looked like he'd been carved out of old hardwood, told him he was the stubbornest human being he had ever met, and he did not say it like a compliment. Ethan thanked him anyway. Over the next 8 years, he operated in several different theaters. The details of most of his assignments were classified in ways that would not become declassified for decades. What he would tell you, what he had told exactly nobody in Blackridge, was that he was good at his job. He was very good at his job. And being very good at that particular job cost something that didn't show up on any medical record or psych evaluation. It cost you sleep. It cost you the ability to sit in a crowded restaurant without putting your back to a wall. It cost you something in the way you heard loud noises, something in the way you watched strangers' hands. And then one night it cost him more than that. There was a mission. He didn't think about it with language anymore. Language made it too real, too specific, too something that needed to be processed and examined. He thought about it in shapes, in temperatures, in the particular weight of silence that followed certain sounds. He was the only member of his fire team who came home. He sat in a hospital in Germany for 11 days, and then he came home to the States, and he sat in a room in Virginia for another week and answered questions from men in clean uniforms who smelled like soap and took careful notes and told him he had done everything right. Everything right. He thanked them. And then he got in his truck and drove. Mia's mother, her name was Caroline, had left 2 years before the mission. That was its own story, and not one Ethan spent much time telling even to himself. She was in Portland now, and she called Mia on holidays and birthdays, and sometimes in between, and Mia would talk to her with the careful politeness of a child who has learned to love someone from a careful distance. Ethan never said anything bad about Caroline to Mia. He also never said much good. He just said she was her mother, and she loved her in her own way. Mia seemed to understand in the way children sometimes understand things that adults spend years not being able to say clearly. So there was Ethan, a truck, a duffel bag, a car seat, and a town called Blackridge that didn't ask too many questions. He built a life there, a real one, a quiet one, and for almost 7 years, it held. Sophia Lancaster arrived on a Tuesday in November when the weather couldn't decide whether to rain or just be miserable about the possibility of it. She arrived in a black SUV, one of 2, actually, though the second one peeled off before they reached the town center, and she stepped out in a charcoal wool coat and low-heeled boots and looked at the main street of Blackridge with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look like they're evaluating a property. She was 30 years old. She had founded Lancaster Tech at 24 after 2 years of building software products out of a shared workspace in Austin, and by 28, her company had been valued at slightly under $1 billion. By 30, the slightly under was gone. She had been on the cover of 3 magazines. 2 of them focused almost entirely on the fact that she was a woman. One of them focused entirely on the fact that she was young. None of them focused very much on the fact that she was, at her core, one of the sharpest strategic minds in her industry, which was the only part she actually cared about. Her father, Gerald Lancaster, had built Lancaster Realty into a regional powerhouse and had made sure Sophia understood, from a very young age, that money was not something you received. It was something you earned, then protected, then used as a tool to build something that would outlast you. He had taught her to read a balance sheet before she learned to drive. He had made her sit in board meetings at 14 and asked her afterward what she thought. She had opinions. She always had opinions. But Gerald Lancaster had also, without quite meaning to, built in his daughter a deep and persistent belief that the only way to be taken seriously was to be better than everyone else in the room at all times. Not just good, better, sharper, more prepared, more precise. The cost of that belief, which she had never entirely calculated, was that she had arrived at 30 years old with a company that was doing extremely well, and a personal life that was by any honest measure almost completely empty. She had colleagues. She had a team she trusted professionally. She had a personal assistant named Dara, who was brilliant and organized and who Sophia suspected was more emotionally intelligent than anyone she'd ever met. She did not have friends, exactly. Not the kind you called on a Sunday because you felt like talking. Not the kind who knew which version of your laugh was the real one. The Blackridge Project was something she'd championed personally over objections from her board. The town had a large abandoned industrial corridor, about 14 acres of old processing facilities and warehouse space that had been vacant for 11 years since the paper mill that anchored the local economy had shut down. Sophia's plan was to convert the space into a mixed-use tech and trades hub, affordable workspace for small manufacturers and tech startups, training facilities, childcare, a small medical clinic. The kind of thing that could actually change the economic gravity of a place like this. Her board thought it was too risky, too local, too personal. She told them she was doing it anyway. That was usually how it went. She was in Blackridge to spend 2 weeks doing on-the-ground assessment before the development team arrived. She preferred to do this part alone, or close to it. She didn't want the site visits filtered through project managers and architects. She wanted to see the actual space with her own eyes and get her own read on the town. Her assistant had arranged a room at a B&B on Harbor Road run by a woman named Paulette, who made extraordinary cinnamon bread and asked no questions, which Sophia appreciated more than the bread. The first 3 days were fine. She walked the site, took her own notes, had coffee at the diner, and listened to the conversations around her, got a sense of who the town was and what it needed. She had a system. It worked. On the 4th day, she made a mistake. She went back to the industrial site after dark. This was not the plan. The plan was to review permits in the evening, answer emails, get reasonable sleep. But she'd noticed something on the far end of the site, a structural issue with one of the loading dock walls that she wanted to look at again in the context of the drainage layout. And she had the blueprints in her bag and a powerful flashlight, and she decided it would take 45 minutes and she could be back by 9. She told Dara she was going for a walk. She did not tell her where. That was the mistake. The site was huge and dark, and her footsteps echoed off the old concrete in a way that felt larger than she did. She found the loading dock section, pulled the blueprints, crouched down to look at the base of the wall where water damage had left a specific pattern of cracking that indicated something wrong with the drainage line below grade. She was concentrating. She was not paying attention to the sounds behind her. "Well, look at this." The voice came from the left, not the direction she'd entered from. She stood up slowly, turned. 3 men. Young, mid-20s maybe, dressed without any particular intention. 2 of them were big in the way that certain young men are big, broad, taking up space, wearing their size like a piece of information they wanted you to have. The third one, who had spoken, was leaner and had a quality about his face that she associated with a certain kind of person, a person who enjoyed situations where the balance of power was obviously in their favor. "You're the lady trying to buy this place," the lean one said. It wasn't a question. "Lancaster, right? Saw you on the news. My boss knows who you are." She kept her voice level. "I'm not buying it. I'm developing it." That's a polite word for taking it. She didn't respond to that. She was doing the math without letting it show on her face. 3 men. One exit she could see, the kind of dark where nobody would hear much of anything. "What do you want?" she asked. "My boss wants you to think real careful about whether this project is worth the trouble." The lean one took a step closer. "He thinks maybe you've gotten used to having things go your way. He thinks maybe it's time you experienced a little difficulty." "Your boss has a name?" He smiled. "Tonight he's just a message." One of the larger men shifted to her left, the other drifted right. She understood the geometry of what was happening. She had her phone, she had a flashlight that was solid aluminum and weighed about a pound. She ran the numbers and didn't like any of them. "I'd stop there," said a voice from behind her. She went rigid for half a second, then understood, from the tone, that the voice was not aimed at her. The three men looked past her. She turned. A man was standing about 15 feet back, where the shadows made a hard edge at the end of a row of old shelving units. He was not large in a way that announced itself, not the broad billboard kind of large. He was medium height, solid in the way that spoke of function rather than display, and he was wearing a gray canvas jacket with a grease stain on the left forearm that she would later remember as oddly specific. He was looking at the three men with an expression that she could only describe later when she tried to explain it to Dara as completely neutral. Not angry, not scared, not performing anything. His hands were loose at his sides. His posture was easy. That ease, she realized in a delayed way, was the most frightening thing about him. "This is a private conversation," the lean one said. "Then you should have had it somewhere private," the man said. "You've got about 5 seconds to decide to walk away." "Or what?" The bigger one on the left took a step toward him. The man, Ethan, said nothing for a moment, just looked at the man who'd stepped forward. Then he said quietly, "Or you'll leave here in worse shape than you arrived. Your choice. I've got no preference." The lean one studied him. Doing the same kind of math that Sophia had been doing, she could tell, but arriving at a different result than she had. What happened in the next 20 seconds was not elegant. It was not like the movies. It was fast and controlled and deeply uncomfortable to watch. And when it was over, 2 of the 3 men were on the ground, and the third, the lean one, the one who'd done the talking, was standing very still with his right wrist held in a grip he clearly understood was not going to break if he fought it, and the quiet man in the gray jacket was behind him, not even breathing hard. "Now," Ethan said, "you're going to leave, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that I got a very good look at all 3 of you, and if anything else happens to this woman or her project, you're going to have a much worse evening than this one." He released the wrist. The lean man left. His 2 friends followed, one of them limping. Sophia stood in the dark with her blueprints rolled up in her hand and her heart doing something irregular in her chest that she was not going to acknowledge. The man in the gray jacket looked at her. "You okay?" he asked. She catalogued herself quickly. "Yes, you should leave this area before they decide to come back with friends." "I know." She didn't move for a second. "Who are you?" He hesitated in the way of someone who's used to deciding what information to give. "I saw you come in," he said. "I work in the garage on the other end of the block. Sometimes I walk the perimeter before I lock up. Old habit." She looked at him. "Old habit from what?" He didn't answer that directly. "My name's Ethan. My truck's on the street. I'll walk you out." She wanted to ask more. She also understood, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, that this was not the moment to push. She walked beside him out of the dark building and into the cold evening air, and neither of them said anything for most of the walk, and the silence was somehow not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual enough that she noticed it. At the street, she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "Sure. I'd like to—" She stopped herself on the word compensate, because something about how he'd handled himself told her that was exactly the wrong word. "I'd like to thank you properly. Dinner, maybe, or whatever you'd prefer." He looked at her with those dark, measured eyes. "That's not necessary." "It seems necessary to me." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You were in a bad spot. I helped. That's the end of it." He said it simply, without weight or performance. Not false modesty, not fishing for protest, just a statement of how he organized the world. She stood there for a moment after he walked back toward the garage, watching the grease-stained jacket disappear around the corner. In 30 years of life, in a decade of building a company and sitting across tables from people who had every kind of power and every kind of motivation and every kind of approach to other human beings. She had never met anyone quite like that. She pulled out her phone and called Dara. "Hey," Dara said. "How was the walk?" Sophia looked at the dark entrance to the industrial site. "Eventful," she said. "Can you find out what you can about a man named Ethan? Runs an auto shop on Route 9. Just—" She paused. "Find out what there is to know." She stood on the sidewalk for another moment, the cold coming in from the water, the street quiet in all directions. Then she walked back to the B&B and sat down at the desk in her room and tried very hard to focus on the drainage report. She got about 3 paragraphs in. Then she put the report down and stared at the wall. He protected her because someone needed help. She hadn't even known that was what she needed to hear. Dara came back with a file the next morning. Sophia was sitting at the small desk in her room at Paulette's B&B, third cup of coffee going cold beside her, when her phone lit up with a message. "Sending you what I found. It's not much. That's kind of the point." The attached document was 4 pages. Ethan James Vale, born in Medford, Oregon, 32 years old. Enlisted in the United States Navy at 21. That part was straightforward. What came after it was less so. Not because the information was complicated, but because there was so little of it. A service record that went from detailed to vague at a very specific point, the way records sometimes did when the things a person was doing couldn't be cleanly described in standard military language. Then an honorable discharge. Then nothing. No address history until Black Ridge. No social media presence of any kind. A business license for Vale Auto, registered 7 years ago. A school enrollment record for one Mia Grace Vale, currently in 3rd grade at Black Ridge Elementary. That was it. Sophia read it twice. Most people, when you ran a background check on them, produced a certain amount of digital noise, accounts, addresses, purchases, subscriptions, photos tagged by other people. The modern world left fingerprints everywhere, whether you wanted it to or not. Ethan Vale had almost none of that. The absence was too consistent to be accidental. She set the phone down and looked out the window at the gray November morning and thought about a man in a canvas jacket who'd walked away from a thank you with the same ease that most people walked away from a boring conversation. She thought about the way his hands had been loose at his sides, the way he'd looked at 3 men who outweighed him collectively by probably 300 pounds and not shown a single degree of alarm. Old habit, he'd said, about walking the perimeter. She knew what kind of habits were old enough to wire themselves into a person that deep. She picked up her phone and called Dara back. "I want to go back to the garage," she said. "The site?" "Sophia, after last night—" "Not the site, the auto shop, on Route 9. A pause. "You want to go see the mechanic. I want to thank him properly." "You tried that last night." "He said no last night. He hasn't said no today." Another pause, longer this time. Dara had been with Sophia for 4 years and understood the particular texture of her silences and decisions. "Okay, do you want me to? I'll go alone." "Of course you will," Dara said, and Sophia could hear the very precise way in which Dara chose not to say anything further. She drove out to Route 9 at 9:30 in the morning and pulled into the gravel lot beside Vale Auto and sat in her car for a moment looking at the place. The bay doors were open already. The green-black paint looked dark against the pale sky. She could hear a radio playing somewhere inside. Classic country, low and unhurried. She got out of the car. He was underneath a Ford F-150 on the lift when she walked in, and she could see his boots and the lower half of his legs, and hear the sound of a ratchet working in short, precise turns. There was a stool near the tool bench with a child's backpack hanging off the back of it, and a library book left face down on the surface. Something about deep-sea ecosystems. "Be right with you," he said from under the truck, without looking. "Take your time," she said. A pause. The ratchet stopped. He rolled out from under the lift on a creeper, one of those flat boards mechanics used to slide under vehicles, and looked up at her from the floor, and for just a moment his expression did a thing that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite wariness, but was somewhere between the two. Then it settled back into the neutral quality she remembered from the night before. He sat up, got to his feet without using his hands, which she noticed, wiped his palms on a rag tucked into his belt. "Miss Lancaster," he said. "Sophia." She looked around the garage. It was organized in a way that reminded her of her own office. Not perfectly tidy, but intentionally arranged, everything having a logic to its placement. I hope this isn't a bad time. I work all morning, so. He meant yes, but he was letting her stay anyway, which she understood as a kind of courtesy. I wanted to see how you were, she said. He looked at her. I'm fine. You handled 3 men alone last night. I've had worse mornings. She believed him, which was the uncomfortable part. I also wanted to apologize, she said. I shouldn't have gone back there after dark alone. That was careless. He seemed slightly surprised by the apology. Not by the fact of it exactly, but by the directness. You didn't know anyone was watching the property. I should have assumed it was possible. I knew the project had opposition. I wasn't paying attention. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. Not punishing herself, just naming the fact. What those men said? That their boss sent a message. Do you know who operates out of that area at night? Ethan leaned against the workbench, arms folded, and looked at her with the particular quality of someone deciding how much to say. I've seen that lean one before. A few months ago, outside the Harbor Road bar. He was with a man named Decker, who does contract work for some of the commercial developers that have been circling this area. I don't know who Decker works for. Could be several people. Could be Victor Hale, Sophia said. Who's that? She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Someone I made the mistake of trusting. He didn't push her on it, just waited, which she appreciated more than most people would have understood. Victor was my co-founder at Lancaster Tech, she said, for the first 2 years. We had a falling out over the direction of the company, and I bought him out. He believed, he still believes, that the company's success belongs to him, that I couldn't have built it without him. She paused. He's wrong. But wrong people with money and connections can still cause a great deal of damage. Ethan was watching her, not the way people usually watched her, not with the careful attention of someone trying to figure out what she was worth or what she wanted or what they could get from her. More like the way you'd watch a road you weren't sure about, trying to read the surface. You think he sent those men to scare you off the project, Ethan said. It fits his approach. He doesn't come at things directly. He creates pressure and waits for people to make decisions out of fear. She met Ethan's eyes. I'm not particularly afraid. I noticed, he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite humor, but had a little of both in it. She looked at the library book on the bench. Your daughter's? He glanced over at it. She leaves things everywhere. Marine biology? Something shifted in his face. Not much. Just a small easing, like a door that had been almost closed opening another half-inch. That's her current direction. Changes about every 8 months. Before this, it was aerospace engineering. Before that, it was veterinary medicine, specifically large animals, which was a phase I wasn't prepared for. Sophia found herself almost smiling. How old? 8. She must be something. Yeah, he said simply. She is. There was a moment in the conversation then that had a particular quality, not awkward, but open, like a space where something could be said or not said, and either would be fine. Sophia had spent most of her adult life filling spaces like that with information or strategy or forward momentum. She didn't fill this one. I want to hire you, she said, not to be a bodyguard. I don't want a bodyguard. I want someone who knows this area, knows who operates in it, and can help me understand what I'm dealing with. Unofficially. On your terms. He was quiet for a moment. I'm a mechanic. You're not only a mechanic. In Blackridge I am. The service record that cuts off at a classified point would disagree with that. She held his gaze. I'm not trying to dig up your history. I looked because I needed to understand who helped me last night. I'm not interested in anything you don't choose to tell me. His jaw tightened. Not in anger exactly. More the way a person tightens when something true lands somewhere they weren't expecting it. You ran a background check. Yes. And? And there's almost nothing there, which told me more than a full file would have. He looked at the floor for a moment. The radio played something slow and sad about a highway and a woman who didn't wait. Then he looked back up. I'm not for hire, he said. I know, but I'm also not going to pretend I'm not curious about who sent those men. She waited. I've got Mia from 3 to 8, he said. I don't take work that touches her life. Understood. And I'm not following your instructions. If I look into this, It's because I want to know. And I'll tell you what I find if and when I decide it's worth telling you. That's fine. He looked at her steadily. That's fine? Most people in your position would want a contract, terms, regular updates. I'm not most people in my position, she said. I think you already know that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do yet. A small thing. He uncrossed his arms. There's coffee in the office, he said. If you want to tell me what you actually know about Victor Hale. She followed him into the small cluttered office at the back of the garage, and she sat in the chair across from a desk covered in invoices and a child's drawing of what appeared to be a whale fighting a submarine, and she told him everything. It took about 40 minutes. She didn't have the habit of telling people everything. It was a habit she'd actually trained herself out of because in business, information was leverage and you didn't give leverage away. But something about the way Ethan listened, kept completely still, no phone, no notepad, just listening, made the usual calculations feel beside the point. She told him how she and Victor had met in Austin at a startup incubator, how they'd spent 18 months building the core architecture of Lancaster Tech together, how the break had happened when Victor wanted to take the company in a direction she believed was both ethically wrong and strategically stupid. She told him about the buyout, the number, the agreement Victor had signed. She told him about the incident since small things, individually meaningless. A key investor who'd gotten an anonymous letter full of inaccuracies about the company's financials. A journalist who'd asked questions that could only have come from someone with insider knowledge. A contract that had almost fallen through because of a rumor about regulatory problems that didn't exist. He's been at this for 2 years, she said, slowly, patiently, laying groundwork. What does he want? Ethan asked. Specifically? The company. Or he wants to break it down enough that he can buy it back at a fraction of what it's worth. She pressed her fingers against the coffee cup without drinking from it. Victor is the kind of person who can wait a very long time to feel like he's won. And the Blackridge project specifically? This project is important to me personally, not just professionally. She looked at her hands. Victor knows that. He knows that if he can kill this, publicly, visibly, it damages the company's reputation and it damages mine, and it also destroys something I actually care about. She looked up, which is probably why it's where he chose to move. Ethan was quiet, turning this over. She watched him think, not the performed contemplation of someone buying time, but actual visible processing. His eyes went somewhere else for a moment, came back. Those 3 men weren't professionals, he said. The lean one had practiced being threatening, but he hadn't been trained in it. The other 2 were muscle for hire, not enforcement. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Victor sent them to frighten you and see how you'd respond. He wanted information about how you react to pressure. Last night was a probe. She had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by someone who read situations the way he clearly did, made it land differently. Which means he'll try something else now. Yeah, and it'll be different in kind. He learned last night didn't work. He also doesn't know about you, she said. Ethan considered this. I'd like to keep it that way. She nodded. What do you need from me? Send me everything you have on Victor Hale. Business dealings, known associates, current projects, anything you can get without raising flags. Don't go back to that site alone after dark. And he stopped. And? Try to look like you're not worried, like last night didn't change anything. If Victor's watching, you want him to think the probe failed because you didn't notice it, not because it was stopped. She thought about this. Behave normally. Within reason. I'm very good at that, she said. He looked at her with a quality that she was beginning to recognize as his version of skepticism. Understated, precise, delivered through a slightly longer pause than usual. Are you? I run a billion-dollar company. I'm in meetings every week with people who are trying to assess my weaknesses, and I'm trying to assess theirs, and we're all pretending we're talking about quarterly projections. She held his gaze. Yes, I'm very good at performing normal. That's not exactly what I meant, he said. She waited. Performing normal is one thing, he said. Actually being steady enough that it doesn't cost you. That's different. One of those is theater, the other one, he paused, seemed to decide something. The other one takes practice. She understood there was something personal in that. She didn't reach for it. I'll work on it, she said. He almost smiled. That almost smile again. She was starting to be able to see it now. The small movement at the outer corners of his eyes that came a half second before the rest of his face made up its mind. She left at 11, drove back toward the B&B, the sky still gray and low, the water just visible between the buildings as she came down off Route 9. She called Dara and asked her to pull together a comprehensive file on Victor Hale's current business activities and known associates and send it to a new encrypted address she created for the purpose. Dara, to her credit, only asked one question. "Are we doing this through official channels?" "No," Sophia said. "Okay." A pause. "How's the mechanic?" "Don't. I'm just asking." "Dara." "Right. File by end of day." Sophia ended the call and drove the rest of the way in silence, and she tried not to think about the whale fighting a submarine drawing on the desk, or the way his arms had uncrossed, or the particular plainness of the way he'd said she is when she'd asked about Mia. She almost managed it. The file came that evening. She read it at the desk in her room with a glass of water and a legal pad, taking notes the old-fashioned way. The way she'd done since business school, when she'd found that writing by hand made her retain patterns better than typing. Victor Hale, 43. Second-generation money from a commercial real estate family in Dallas. Had pivoted to tech in his late 30s after two companies that had both dissolved in ways that were, technically, legal, but involved a pattern of behavior that Sophia recognized because she had watched it up close. He built things to a certain point and then strip-mined them. I was very good at finding undervalued assets and people and extracting value from them, and he had mistaken that particular talent for the more difficult one of actually building something. He had 3 known business associates who operated as what people in certain circles called fixers, people who made problems disappear through means that could range from entirely legal to considerably less so. One of them, a man named Roy Carver, who ran a private consulting operation out of Providence, had a history that included 2 investigations by state attorneys and no convictions. Sophia circled Roy Carver's name. She wrote, "Decker-Edels-Carver connection?" She underlined it. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about what Ethan had said about performing normal versus actually being steady enough that it didn't cost you. She thought about how she'd spent most of her adult life getting very good at the performance and had told herself the performance was the same as the real thing. She was beginning to think she'd been wrong about that. Downstairs, she could hear Paulette moving around in the kitchen. A radio. The smell of something baking, rising through the floorboards in a way that was domestically, simply, nice. She sat there a minute, just taking that in, which was not something she usually did. Then she picked up the legal pad and kept working. 3 days passed in which the surface of things stayed calm. Sophia conducted her site visits, attended a preliminary meeting with the local planning office, had coffee with 2 council members and a woman named June Hartley, who ran the Small Business Association, and who had more precise opinions about the town's economic needs than anyone Sophia had met in 3 years of project development work. She took careful notes. She asked real questions. She behaved normally. She was also, beneath that surface, aware of things she hadn't been aware of before. A car that appeared in her peripheral vision twice in one afternoon, on roads that didn't share a logical route. A man she didn't recognize who seemed to be working on something near the industrial site in circumstances that didn't add up. Small things. The kind of things that wouldn't have registered before. She documented them and sent them to the encrypted address. Ethan responded in brief, plain messages that read like field notes. Nothing conversational. Just, "Cars registered to a holding company out of Providence, looking into it." Or, "Man near the site has been there before." Not local. Taking pictures of the loading dock drainage. Or, on the 3rd evening, "Carver is in town. Staying at the Whitmore Motor Lodge on Route 11. Arrived yesterday." That last one she sat with for a while. She typed back, "How do you know that?" His response came 40 minutes later, which she had learned meant he'd been with Mia and had waited until she was asleep. "I know the woman who runs the motor lodge. She mentioned a man who paid cash and asked her to note any other out-of-towners who came through. He asked her to watch for other out-of-towners." "Yes. I told her you were here for business and not to mention it." She appreciated that he'd already handled it. She appreciated more that he told her he'd handled it rather than just handling it invisibly. The distinction mattered to her. She'd worked with enough people who managed information as a power move to recognize what it looked like when someone wasn't doing that. She typed, "Thank you." He responded, Don't thank me yet. Carver being here in person means Victor is escalating. This isn't probes anymore. She read that twice. Set the phone down. Picked up the legal pad. The next morning, she drove to Vale Auto at 8, before the bay doors were fully open, and found Ethan in the parking lot drinking coffee from a metal thermos and watching the road in the way she was starting to recognize. Not obviously watching, just aware. The way certain animals were aware of a space without appearing to scan it. Mia was sitting on the tailgate of his truck in a winter coat that was slightly too big for her, backpack between her feet, eating a piece of toast with an air of philosophical contentment. Sophia parked and got out. Mia looked at her with frank, uncomplicated assessment. "You're the billionaire," Mia said. "Mia," Ethan said. "What?" "She is." Mia looked at Sophia with the clear-eyed directness of a child who had not yet learned that certain observations were supposed to stay internal. "Dad said you came by the shop." "I did," Sophia said. "You must be Mia. I heard about the marine biology." Something lit up in the girl's face immediately. "Did you know that the Mariana Trench has species that have never been fully cataloged? Like there are things down there that humans have never actually seen. We just know they exist because of—" She stopped herself, which looked like a significant effort. "Sorry, Dad says I explained too much about the ocean." "I don't mind," Sophia said honestly. "I didn't know that. About the uncatalogued species. There are probably thousands." Mia said it with the particular reverence of someone describing something sacred. "Maybe more." Sophia looked at Ethan. I was watching his daughter with an expression that was so unguarded and so different from every other expression she'd seen on his face that it almost felt like an intrusion to see it. He seemed to realize she was watching, and the guard came back. Not unfriendly, just present. "School bus at 8:15, he said to Mia. "I know." Mia took another bite of toast. "Is she going to help you with the thing?" "What thing?" Ethan said. "The thing you won't talk about." Mia looked between them with the accuracy of a child who has spent years reading her father's selective silences. "You've been on your phone a lot in the evenings. That's usually when you're working out a problem." Ethan looked at his daughter for a moment. Something passed over his face that was hard to name. Not irritation, not quite affection, something that included both and was larger than either. "You're too observant," he said. "You always say that like it's a criticism." Mia finished the toast and brushed crumbs off her coat. "It's not a criticism. You taught me to pay attention." He didn't have an answer for that. The school bus came 8 minutes later, and Mia jumped off the tailgate and picked up her backpack and started across the lot, and then turned back. "It was nice to meet you," she said to Sophia, with the precision of a child who had been taught manners and chose to use them. "I hope you get the project done. Towns like this need something to happen in them." She got on the bus, the doors closed, the bus pulled away. Sophia and Ethan stood in the parking lot. "She's remarkable," Sophia said. "She's terrifying," he said, but the way he said it was the clearest window she'd yet had into what he actually felt about his daughter, which was something closer to awe than anything else. He looked back at the road where the bus had gone, and she could see the moment when he set that feeling aside and came back to the present. "Carver is not here to run another probe," he said, his voice dropping back into the flat operational register she'd come to associate with the part of him that wasn't just a mechanic and a father. "He's here to build a case, collect information he can use to manufacture something, a scandal, a legal problem, a financial irregularity. Victor is done waiting." "What do we do?" He looked at her. "We find out what he's collecting before he can use it." "And how do we do that?" He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. She had learned to wait out these silences, that they ended when they were finished and not before. "I know someone," he said. "Someone who might be able to give us a cleaner picture of what Victor's actually planning." He paused. "It's not a comfortable conversation for me, but it's probably necessary." She understood instinctively not to ask who. He'd tell her, or he wouldn't. "Okay," she said. "Tonight," he said. "I'll know more tonight." She nodded. She looked at the garage, the dark green doors, the hand-stenciled name, Vale Auto. The ordinary surface of a life that was not entirely ordinary. She thought about Victor, sitting somewhere with money and patience and Roy Carver, and the quiet, methodical certainty that everyone could be broken if you found the right place to apply pressure. She thought about the man standing beside her, who had once been part of the most dangerous operational units in the United States military, and had walked away from it to fix engines and make sure an 8-year-old girl got on the school bus. She thought about all the things Victor didn't know. "Tonight, then," she said. She got back in her car and drove toward town, and she didn't look in the rearview mirror because she had decided, consciously, deliberately, not to be the kind of person who looked back to check if someone was still watching. She was working on being actually steady instead of just performing it. It was harder than it looked. But she was getting there. The person Ethan needed to talk to was named Marcus Webb, and the fact that he needed to talk to him at all was not something Ethan had anticipated when he'd woken up that morning. Marcus had been in the same unit for 3 years. Not the same fire team, different operational background, different skill set. Where Ethan had been trained for direct action, Marcus had been intelligence side, the kind of operator who could sit in a room with someone for 40 minutes and come out knowing things that person had never intended to share. They'd crossed paths on 2 joint operations and had developed the particular kind of trust that forms between people who have been in genuinely dangerous places together and come out the other side without either of them doing something that got the other one killed. Marcus had left the service a year before Ethan had. He now ran a private intelligence consulting firm out of Boston that did work Ethan chose not to think about in too much detail. They spoke rarely. When they did, it was because one of them needed something that couldn't be gotten through ordinary channels. Ethan made the call from his truck, parked on the far end of the Vale auto lot, after Mia was in bed and the garage was locked. He sat with the windows down despite the cold, because he'd always thought better with moving air, even when the air wasn't moving. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Ethan Vale," he said. "I was wondering when you'd surface." "You were wondering?" "Let's say I noticed some activity around a certain project in a certain coastal town and thought of you. Funny how that works?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He'd forgotten, or allowed himself to forget, how Marcus operated. The way he filed things, connected things, maintained a peripheral awareness of the world that most people would find exhausting or paranoid or both. "You're monitoring the Blackridge development." "I'm aware of it. There's a difference." A pause. "Roy Carver has 2 clients right now that are interesting to me professionally. Victor Hale is one of them. When Carver showed up in your town, I made a note. And you didn't call me." "You've worked very hard to be a mechanic, Ethan. I respect the project." There was no mockery in it, which was the thing about Marcus. He said things that could sound like mockery and weren't. "What do you need?" "Everything you have on what Victor Hale is building, not the public-facing stuff, the actual architecture." A silence that meant Marcus was deciding something. "This is for the Lancaster woman. This is because someone sent 3 amateurs to threaten a woman in a dark building in my town, and I'd like to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with." Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive. "Marcus." "All right." Another pause, longer, the kind where Ethan could almost hear him thinking through what he was willing to say on an unencrypted line and what needed to wait. "Not on the phone. I can come to you, 2 days." "You'd come to Blackridge." "I've been meaning to see the coast." Ethan exhaled. "Fine. I'll text you the address." "Don't bother. I know where the garage is." He said it without emphasis, which was somehow worse. 2 days, Ethan. And be careful with Carver. He's not like the men he sends ahead of himself." The call ended. Ethan sat in his truck for a while, looking at the dark shape of the garage against the darker sky, listening to the distant sound of the water that you could sometimes hear from Route 9 when the wind was right, and everything else was quiet enough. He had spent 7 years building a life that did not require phone calls like this one. He was aware, sitting in the truck, that the building of that life had perhaps been more fragile than he'd allowed himself to believe. Not because the life was fake. Mia was real. The garage was real. The particular weight of a Tuesday evening in November in Blackridge, with the cold coming in and the radio off, and the sense that the day was done and tomorrow was manageable, that was real. But the person he'd been before was also real, and it turned out that person didn't stay as quiet as he'd hoped when the right circumstances arrived. He went inside, stood in the kitchen for a minute, not hungry, not tired yet, looked at Mia's drawings on the refrigerator. There were 11 of them in various stages of artistic development, the oldest one from when she was 5 showing a lopsided house with a blue truck outside. The newest one, a surprisingly detailed attempt at a blue whale that showed she'd been studying actual reference images. He stood there looking at them for longer than made logical sense. Then he went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours thinking about Roy Carver. The 2 days passed in the way that tense waiting periods always did, with too much surface normalcy and too much internal noise. Ethan worked. He fixed a transmission on a Chevy that had been waiting 3 weeks, replaced a head gasket on a Subaru for a woman named Terry who drove over from Millhaven every time because she didn't trust anyone closer. He helped Mia with a project on ocean pressure zones that involved a lot of graph paper and one moderately heated argument about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. He also watched. Not obviously. Just in the background of everything else. The car from Providence drove past twice more. A man he didn't recognize had lunch at the diner 2 days running and asked June Hartley questions about the planning department that June later mentioned to him with a slight, careful frown. She didn't know what to make of it, she said. Ethan told her the man was probably just a journalist doing background research, and June accepted this because she wanted to and because Ethan had never given her a reason to doubt him. He sent Sophia brief updates. She responded briefly. She was doing her part, attending meetings, making site visits, behaving with a composure that Ethan suspected was costing her more than she showed. Marcus arrived on a Thursday morning. He drove a nondescript rental sedan that was somehow exactly the right car for a man who didn't want to be remembered. He was 41, black, with a build that had once been military and had softened only slightly at the edges. He had the kind of face that was completely unremarkable until he decided to pay attention to you, and then it was the most attentive face in any room. He pulled into the Vale auto lot at 7:45 before Mia's bus had come, and he sat in his car and waited, which was the professionally correct thing to do. Ethan walked out and opened the car door. "You're early." "You said morning." Marcus got out, looked around the lot, the garage, the road in both directions. It took him maybe 4 seconds. "Nice place." "Don't." "I mean it. It's genuinely nice." He looked at Ethan. "You look different." "It's been 7 years?" "Not that kind of different." He studied him for a moment with the attention that had always been slightly uncomfortable coming from Marcus because it was never casual. "You look like someone who sleeps." Ethan didn't answer that. He led him into the garage office, poured coffee, closed the door. Marcus sat down across from the desk and opened a laptop and spent a moment pulling up files, and then he talked for 20 minutes without interruption. What Victor Hale had built over the past 18 months was a quiet architecture of manufactured doubt. Not a single large attack, a systematic erosion. He had people inside 3 financial media outlets who could be nudged toward certain stories. He had a relationship with a regulatory consultant who knew how to file inquiries that triggered automatic review processes, slowing project approvals without technically doing anything illegal. He had used Carver twice before in similar situations, once to obtain private communications from a competitor, once to plant a false document trail that suggested financial mismanagement in a company he'd subsequently been able to acquire at a distressed price. "The plan for Lancaster Tech is a variation on the second playbook," Marcus said. He wants to create the appearance of financial irregularity in the Blackridge project specifically, something that looks like Sophia Lancaster misallocated development funds. If he can get that story placed in 2 or 3 credible outlets before she can respond, the reputational damage alone may be enough to trigger a board review. And if the board loses confidence, she loses control of the company. Not immediately, but the path opens. Marcus closed the laptop. Carver is here to get access to internal project documents, financial records, communications, anything that he can excerpt or alter to build the false narrative. How is he planning to get access? He's already cultivated a contact inside the planning department, junior staff member, financial pressure, it's the usual vector. Marcus picked up his coffee. Her name is Amy Cho. She's 26, she's got $60,000 in student loans, and 3 weeks ago she started receiving anonymous transfers of $300 a week. Ethan sat with this for a moment. Does she know what she's helping him build? Probably not the full picture. She thinks she's passing along procedural documents to a journalist. She's not a criminal, she's desperate. Yes, Marcus said, which is how these things usually work. The office was quiet. The radio in the bay was off. Ethan had turned it off before Marcus arrived without quite deciding to. Outside, the November sky was the same flat gray it had been for most of the week. Can you document the financial transfers to Amy Cho? Ethan asked. I can provide you with information that would allow someone with the right legal standing to document them, yes. And the media contacts? The planted document trail from his previous operations? That's more complicated, but there's an attorney in Boston who's been building a case against Carver's operation independently. If Lancaster's legal team were to reach out to her, there might be a conversation worth having. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and set it on the desk. I'm not here. This conversation didn't happen. Understood. Marcus looked at him steadily. This is going to get more physical before it gets legal, Ethan. Carver doesn't like loose ends. When he figures out someone's been working against him locally, let me worry about that part. I know. Marcus stood, picked up his cup, looked around the office one more time with the comprehensive attention that he seemed unable to turn off. His eyes stopped on Mia's whale and submarine drawing, still on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. She's 8? 8.5. She'll tell you the half matters. Marcus looked at the drawing a moment longer. Don't let this get close to her. I won't. I know you think you won't. I'm saying don't. He put down the cup. There's a difference. He left 20 minutes later, taking the coastal road north, the nondescript rental sedan disappearing around the curve without anyone on Route 9 having any particular reason to notice it. Ethan sat in the office for a while after he left. Read the name on the card Marcus had left. Turned it over. Then he pulled out his phone and typed a message to the encrypted address. Need to meet tonight. Bring your lawyer's contact information if you have one. I have names. Sophia arrived at the garage at 8 that evening. The bay was closed and the lot was dark except for the light in the office window. She knocked at the side door. He'd told her to use the side door. And he let her in and she sat across from him at the desk and he laid out what Marcus had told him, stripped down, just the facts in sequence. She was very still while he talked. He had noticed this about her in their previous conversations, that she didn't perform reactions. She absorbed things internally and was quiet until she'd finished absorbing them, and only then did anything show on her face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Amy Cho, she said. You know her? I know of her. She's been processing permit applications for the project. I've seen her name on documents. She pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the desk, a small gesture, something working itself out. She's 26 and she has $60,000 in loans, and someone offered her what felt like a manageable solution, and she said yes because she was tired of not having options. She said it without sentimentality and without judgment, which Ethan thought was its own kind of mercy. We need to stop using her as a conduit before she does something she can't walk back from. Agreed. If she hands Carver actual project documents, even if we can prove they were altered, the story has already run. The retraction never catches the headline. We need to get ahead of it. Sophia looked at the business card on the desk. The attorney Marcus mentioned, she's building a case against Carver independently? That's what he said. Then she has something to gain from sharing, and we have documentation on the transfers to Amy Cho, which is something she probably doesn't have. Sophia looked at him. I'll call her tomorrow morning, but there's a faster problem. Carver. Carver's already here and he already has a contact inside the planning department. Even if we cut off Amy Cho, he'll find another angle. We need him to leave Blackridge without what he came for. She paused. Or we need him to think he got it. Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him, and in the lamplight and the quiet of the closed office, he was aware that this was not the woman who had been surrounded in a dark warehouse 10 days ago. That woman had been capable and composed, but she had been isolated, operating alone inside her own architecture of plans and defenses. This was different. She was thinking alongside him, not beside him. It was a small distinction. It made a significant difference. You're thinking about feeding him false documents, Ethan said. I'm thinking about giving Carver exactly what he's looking for, in the exact form that would be most useful to him, and watching what he does with it. She folded her hands on the desk. If he takes fabricated documents back to Victor, and Victor uses them, uses documents that we created, then we have them, provably, on record, using manufactured evidence. That's a trap. Yes. It's also legally complicated, depending on how it's constructed, which is why I need to talk to the attorney in Boston before I do anything else. She met his eyes. But the concept is sound. He thought about it. It was sound. It was also the kind of move that required precision in every step. The false documents had to be credible enough that Carver would use them without deeper verification, and they had to be traceable enough that their fabricated nature could be established in court, and they had to be obtained by Carver in a way that didn't give him a legal argument about entrapment. You'd need someone inside the planning department to give him the documents, Ethan said, which means Amy Cho. We'd need to talk to Amy Cho, Sophia said, directly. Tell her what she's actually involved in and give her a way out that doesn't destroy her life. That's a risk. If she goes back to Carver, people generally don't go back to the person who's been exploiting them when they're offered a real alternative. She said it with a quiet certainty that he thought came from somewhere personal. He didn't ask. She needs to know what she's actually doing, not because it's strategically useful, though it might be, but because she deserves to know. The word deserve sat there in the office between them in a way that was different from how strategy usually sounded. Ethan turned it over and understood, for the first time fully, that Sophia Lancaster's intelligence and her ethics were not separate operating systems. They ran together, in the same current. He thought about what Marcus had said that morning. You look like someone who sleeps. He thought about what it had cost him to sleep, the years of work, the controlled distance, the careful architecture of a life that didn't ask too much of him. He thought about sitting in this office 2 weeks ago with no particular complications, and Mia's homework spread across the bench and the radio playing and nothing requiring this quality of attention. I wasn't sorry the complications had arrived. That was the thing he couldn't quite put to rest. All right, he said. Amy Cho first. Who approaches her? I do. She's more likely to trust me than someone she doesn't know. Carver might have someone watching her. Then we do it somewhere she'd normally go. Somewhere a conversation between a project developer and a planning department employee would be completely unremarkable, she thought. She has lunch at the sandwich place on Harbor Road most Tuesdays. I've seen her there twice. Today is Thursday. Then we have until Tuesday to prepare. She looked at the card on the desk again. And the attorney in Boston to talk to first. Ethan nodded. I'll see if I can find out how much Carver has already collected, whether he's ready to move or still building the package. How will you find that out? He was quiet for a moment. There was a man named Del Porter who drank at the Harbor Road bar most Thursday evenings, and who had, at various points over the past 7 years, shared information with Ethan in the easy, unfocused way of someone who didn't know he was sharing information. Del worked for one of the commercial developers that had long wanted the industrial site, and had connections that ran sideways into the kind of operations Carver represented. It was not a clean source. It was an available one. I know some people, he said. She accepted this the way she accepted several things he said, not pushing for the specifics, trusting the process. He had noticed this about her, and he appreciated it in the way that was difficult to articulate, not as a professional courtesy, but as something more basic. Most people in high-pressure situations needed to control the information flow completely. Sophia was comfortable with what she didn't know, as long as she trusted the person who knew it. He wasn't entirely sure when he'd become that person for her, but he was aware that he had. There's something else, she said. He waited. Dara told me this afternoon that 2 of my board members received calls this week from a financial analyst they've both worked with previously. The analyst was asking questions, framed as due diligence on a rumored acquisition, but the questions were specifically about the Blackridge project's financial structure and my personal involvement in funding it. She looked at her hands. Victor's starting to move the board. How many board members are vulnerable? 2 of the 11 I'd characterize as uncertain. The other 9, she paused. The other 9 respect results, and I've delivered results. But if a credible financial misconduct story breaks while they're already uncertain, the math changes. How long before the analyst's questions become a story somewhere? If Victor has the documents he needs, a week, maybe less. If he's still waiting for them, she looked at him. This is why Carver needs to not get what he came for, or get what we give him instead. Tuesday, Ethan said. Tuesday, she agreed. He walked her to her car because the lot was dark, and because he'd developed, without consciously deciding to, a habit of making sure she got to her car when she was on his property after dark. He was aware this was not strictly necessary. She was a capable woman who had navigated considerably more dangerous circumstances than a dark parking lot in Blackridge. But the habit had formed, and he wasn't examining it too closely. At the car, she stopped and looked at him. Can I ask you something? She said. Depends. When you left the service, after... She stopped. chose her words carefully, which he noticed. After what happened, did you know this was where you were going? Blackridge. The garage, this particular life. He looked at her. No. You just drove. Pretty much? She nodded slowly, looking somewhere past him at the dark road. I've been building towards something my whole life, specific targets, specific plans. I've never just driven. Doesn't sound like you. No. She paused. I'm starting to think I missed some things. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the night road and the thin line of cloud that had covered the stars. The driving isn't better than the plan. It's just different. You end up in places you didn't choose, which is sometimes exactly the right place, and sometimes just the place you ended up. He looked back at her. You chose Blackridge. I did. That's not the same as driving. She seemed to consider this. No, I suppose it's not. She opened the car door. Ethan. She said his name with a directness that had no performance in it. Thank you. Not for the professional assistance, for... She stopped again, and for a moment the composure shifted, not collapsed, just shifted, the way light changes when a cloud moves. For treating this like it matters. It does matter, he said. She got in the car. He watched the headlights move out of the lot and down Route 9 until they disappeared behind the tree line. He stood in the dark for a minute after that. The wind off the water had picked up, cold enough now to mean business. The season was moving. Blackridge in late November had a particular quality of settling in, the way the town seemed to pull its collar up and accept that this was what things were for a while. He had always found something honest about it. No pretense, just weather. He went back inside, locked the office, walked home on the residential path that ran behind the properties on Route 9, the way he always walked home when he wasn't driving, hands in his pockets, listening to the town settle around him. The house on Meridian Street was dark except for the lamp he left on in the front room. The porch steps creaked in the second-to-last step the way they always had, and he had never gotten around to fixing, and at this point considered a feature rather than a flaw. He went in quietly, checked Mia's door, ajar, the way she slept, the small sound of her breathing audible and steady. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Marcus's voice came back to him. Don't let this get close to her. There's a difference. He knew the difference. He had always known it. But knowing a difference and maintaining it were two separate skills, and he was aware, standing in the hall with one eye on his daughter's door and his mind running through Carver's movements and Sophia's plan and the name on Marcus's card, that he was presently doing both at once. He went to the kitchen, made himself a cup of tea he didn't particularly want, sat at the small table where Mia ate breakfast and where her ocean books were stacked in a pile that suggested a system that he couldn't quite decode. He picked up the book on top. Blue Whales. He opened it to a random page and read 2 paragraphs about the navigational patterns of mature females in the North Pacific. He read it twice. Then he put the book down and sat there with the tea going cold in front of him, and he thought about the fact that Sophia Lancaster had asked him, in a dark parking lot, whether he'd known where he was going when he left. He hadn't, but he'd ended up here. He still wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but for the first time in a long time, he found that not knowing didn't make him want to get up and move. He sat there until the tea was cold and the house was quiet, and then he went to bed, and this time he slept. Tuesday came with low clouds and the kind of cold that had stopped pretending to be temporary. Ethan was up at 5:30, which was not unusual. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark yard, and ran through the day's sequence in his mind the way he used to run through pre-mission checks. Not anxiously, just methodically, the way you confirmed that everything that was supposed to be in place was in place before you moved. The attorney in Boston was named Claire Ashworth, and Sophia had called her Friday morning. The conversation had lasted 2 hours. Ethan hadn't been on the call, but Sophia had given him a precise summary afterward, sitting on a stool in his garage with a notepad on her knee, and he had understood from the summary that Claire Ashworth was exactly the kind of attorney that Roy Carver would not want involved in anything connected to his operations. She had been building a case against Carver's methods for 14 months. She had 2 former clients of his who had agreed to cooperate. She did not have documentation of financial transfers to a third party being used as an instrument of coercion, which was what Sophia was now able to offer her. The arrangement they'd reached was careful and took until Sunday to finalize. Claire Ashworth's team would prepare the legal framework. Sophia's team would document the transfers to Amy Cho through legitimate financial forensics. And the conversation with Amy Cho on Tuesday would be handled by Sophia alone, in the sandwich place on Harbor Road, in plain sight, with nothing about it that would look like anything other than two women having lunch. Ethan's job on Tuesday was not to be in the sandwich place. His job was to know where Carver was. He'd gotten that information from Del Porter on Thursday evening in the way he'd expected, sideways, without Del knowing he'd provided it. Del had been talking about a contract dispute involving one of the commercial developers and had mentioned, in passing, that a consultant from out of town was meeting with certain parties on Tuesday afternoon at the Whitmore Motor Lodge, which meant Carver would be at the Motor Lodge receiving whatever Amy Cho was supposed to deliver. What Amy Cho was going to deliver, if Tuesday went the way Sophia intended, was not what Carver had paid for. Ethan poured his second coffee. Mia's alarm go off upstairs. The sound of a phone playing something that was either a pop song or a nature documentary theme, he could never tell which. And then the sound of her moving around with the particular energy of someone who treated mornings as an inconvenience to be processed quickly rather than endured. She came downstairs in her school clothes with her hair half brushed and sat at the table and poured cereal and looked at him with the alert, assessing quality she had most mornings. "You didn't sleep much," she said. "I slept fine. You've got the face." "What face?" "The one where you slept, but you were also thinking the whole time." She ate a spoonful of cereal. "I get that face too sometimes, usually before a math test." He looked at her. "You don't get math test face. You like math. I like marine biology math. Regular math is less interesting." She considered her cereal. "Is the Sophia thing happening today?" He set down his cup. "Why do you think something's happening today?" "Because you've been running through something in your head all morning, and you do that when things are about to happen, and not when you're just waiting." She looked at him with the clear-eyed patience of someone who has spent 8 years studying one person very carefully. "Also, you made a second coffee, and you don't usually need two." He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing's going to happen that you need to worry about." "I'm not worried." She said it simply, and it was true, which was both reassuring and slightly disconcerting. "I just like to know what's going on." "I know you do." "You're not going to tell me." "Not yet." She accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had learned that not yet from her father was not the same as never, and ate the rest of her cereal. Then she got her backpack and her coat and paused at the kitchen door. "Tell Sophia hi," she said. "I'm not seeing Sophia today." "Tell her anyway, when you do." She went out the door, and a minute later he heard the bus. And then it was quiet. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he rinsed the cups, got his jacket, and went to the garage. He did real work until 10. An alignment job on a Jeep that needed care, a battery replacement on an old Cadillac that belonged to a man named Howard Fisk, who was 81 and drove 3 miles to church every Sunday and 5 miles to the grocery store every Wednesday, and that was the full extent of his driving life, and who talked, while Ethan worked in the easy, companionable way of older men who had made peace with the fact that conversation didn't always need to be going somewhere. Howard talked about his wife, who had died 4 years ago, about his son, who lived in Denver and called on Sundays, about the winter of 2009, which had produced, according to Howard, the finest snowfall he had ever seen in 40 years of living on the coast. Ethan listened and worked and thought about Sophia sitting across from Amy Cho in the sandwich place, and the particular skill required to tell someone the truth about their situation without making them feel trapped by it. At 11:15, his phone buzzed. "Sophia. She's here starting now." He typed back. "Carver still at the motel. Del confirmed 20 minutes ago." He set the phone down and finished Howard's battery and helped him to his car and watched the old Cadillac pull carefully out of the lot. Howard's hands at 10 and 2, moving at the precise speed of someone who understood that he was operating heavy machinery and took the responsibility seriously. Then he went back into the office and waited. The waiting was the thing he'd always been least natural at, which was an irony given how much of his former work had involved it. You could train patience into your body and your operational behavior and still have a mind that wanted to move. He'd learned to let the mind run its course without acting on it. Let it do what it needed to do and stay in the chair. He read the rest of Mia's Blue Whale book. He was 2/3 through it by the time his phone buzzed again. "Sophia, done." She was crying before I finished the first paragraph. She said she knew something was wrong. She's in. He exhaled slowly. Typed, does she need anything? Sophia. I gave her Claire Ashworth's number. She called while I was still there. Claire is handling it. Amy is going to make the delivery as planned, except what she'll be delivering is what Claire's team prepared. Carver will verify before he uses it. Claire says he verifies visually and cross-references against document metadata. The preparation accounts for both. He'll believe it's real. Ethan sat with this. It was a clean plan. It had the quality of plans that had been thought through from multiple directions, where the weaknesses had been found and addressed rather than ignored. He'd worked with people who planned this way, and people who didn't, and the difference between those two groups was measurable in outcomes. Timeline, he typed. Amy delivers at 2. Carver will move the package to Victor tonight or tomorrow morning based on his previous pattern. Claire has a federal contact who can execute on the financial crimes documentation once Victor attempts to use the material. We need to give Victor enough rope. How long? 48 hours from the delivery, maybe less. He looked at the clock on the office wall. Just past noon. 48 hours from 2 o'clock Tuesday put them at 2 o'clock Thursday. 2 days of waiting while a man who was very good at destroying things received what he believed was the instrument of that destruction and prepared to use it. He didn't love the 48 hours, but he understood it. Okay, he typed. Be visible this afternoon. Planning meeting, whatever you have scheduled. Normal. Already on calendar. Community stakeholders meeting at 4. Good. Don't change anything. He put the phone in his pocket and sat for another minute. Then he got up, went back into the bay, and started on a brake job he'd been putting off because the customer, a 20-year-old named Tyler who worked at the marina, had been calling every 3 days to ask if it was done yet, and Ethan had reached the point where he wanted to finish it simply so the calls would stop. He worked through the afternoon with the radio on low, and the town went about its business around him, and somewhere across town, Amy Cho was walking into the Whitmore Motor Lodge with a folder of documents that were going to cost Roy Carver considerably more than he'd anticipated. The next 48 hours had a strange, stretched quality that Ethan had experienced before in different contexts. The particular tension of a situation that had been set in motion and couldn't be recalled, where all you could do was monitor and be ready. He was present for all of it and occupied by none of it completely. He ate dinner with Mia on Tuesday evening, and she showed him a drawing she'd made of the navigational route of a blue whale pod, and explained it with the focused intensity of a graduate student, and he followed the explanation and asked 2 questions that she answered with visible satisfaction. He drove her to school on Wednesday because the bus was running late, and she wanted to show her teacher the drawing before class. He fixed 3 cars and had a 20-minute conversation with Gerald, the landlord, who had stopped by to mention that the porch railing at the Meridian house was showing rust, and he'd get someone to look at it in spring, and Ethan told him he'd handle it himself, which was the same conversation they'd had twice before and would probably have again. He texted Sophia twice. She texted back each time with the brevity he'd come to recognize as her version of composed, short sentences, no excess. She was holding steady. Wednesday evening, he called Marcus on a number Marcus had given him that was different from the one he'd originally called. He gave him the short version of where things stood. Marcus listened without comment until the end, and then said, Carver's going to figure out the documents are false before the 48 hours is up. Why? Because he's careful. He'll do a secondary verification against internal sources. He has someone inside Lancaster Tech's accounting firm, which is something I didn't know until yesterday, and which you should tell Sophia immediately. The verification will likely happen tonight. If it comes back wrong, he destroys the documents and disappears. Or he goes directly after the source, Amy Cho. Ethan was already reaching for his jacket. I need to move the timeline. You need Claire Ashworth to move the timeline, tonight. He ended the call and immediately called Sophia. She picked up in 2 rings. Marcus says Carver has a source inside your accounting firm, he said without preamble. He'll verify tonight. If the documents don't check out against that source's information, he burns them and goes after Amy. A short silence. I'm calling Claire right now. Can she move fast enough? She has a federal contact ready to execute. The question is whether the contact is willing to move on 12 hours' notice instead of 48. Another brief silence, and in it he could hear her thinking, the precise, rapid quality of someone running calculations at speed. Claire will move. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. She called back in 7. Claire is making the call now. The federal contact needs the financial documentation formally submitted. Dara has it ready. She's been holding it for Thursday, but she can file tonight. A pause. Ethan, if this works, it works tonight. If it doesn't, it'll work, he said. Not because he was certain, but because there was nothing useful in the alternative. There's another problem. Her voice had changed slightly, not less composed, but more careful in the way she was choosing words. Victor knows about you. He was quiet. He called 2 of my board members this afternoon. He told them the reason the Black Ridge project had been compromised was that I'd involved a former Navy SEAL with he used the phrase troubled operational history, in the project's security operations. He said it represented a liability and a judgment failure on my part. She paused. He's had someone looking into you, not Marcus-level research, but enough to know the basic shape. Ethan stood in the dark of his front yard, the cold air coming in off the water, the porch light behind him making a small circle of yellow on the dead grass. How did your board members respond? He said. The 2 uncertain ones are concerned. The 9 others haven't responded yet. I'll hear from them tomorrow. She paused. I want you to know that I didn't confirm or deny anything to anyone. You don't need to explain that. I know, I just want you to know. Another pause, and when she spoke again, the careful composure had something else in it, something that had less structure. He described you as dangerous and unpredictable, as someone whose judgment under pressure couldn't be trusted. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare branches of the tree at the corner of the yard. He's not entirely wrong about the dangerous part. He's completely wrong about the rest of it. She said it with a flatness that meant it wasn't up for discussion. Your history is not a liability. I know what I've seen, and I know what I know, and it is not a liability. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was something about the plainness of her conviction that was harder to receive than he'd expected. Not because he doubted her, but because he'd spent 7 years in a town where nobody knew enough to have that particular opinion about him, and he'd found a kind of safety in that, and now someone knew, and she was standing on the other side of the knowing and saying, still. Thank you, he said, because it was true and it was all he had. Don't thank me, it's just accurate. A breath. Claire's going to call me back within the hour. Stay close to your phone. He stayed close to his phone. He sat on the front porch despite the cold, which was something he did when he needed to think without walls around him. And he thought about Victor Hale sitting somewhere comfortable, in a good chair in a warm room, with money and patience, and the smooth certainty of a man who'd never had to carry anything that cost him real weight. The kind of man who used other people's vulnerabilities as raw material and had talked himself into believing that made him smart rather than cruel. Ethan had met men like Victor in the world before Black Ridge. Not in the service. The service had its failures and its moral complications, but the men he'd served with had understood at some fundamental level that what you were willing to carry defined what you were. No. He'd met Victor's type in the edges of things. The contractors, the consultants, the men in clean rooms who made decisions about other people's lives with the detachment of someone who had never had to stand in the consequences. He didn't hate Victor Hale. Hate required a kind of investment he wasn't willing to make. But he wanted this done. His phone rang at 9:47. Sophia. It's moving, she said, and he could hear something in her voice that was new, not quite relief, more like the feeling of a held breath beginning to release. Claire's contact moved. The financial crimes documentation has been formally submitted. They're treating it as an emergency filing based on ongoing evidence destruction risk. Are they moving on Carver tonight? They're moving on the financial transfers to Amy Cho tonight and on Victor's instruction chain tomorrow morning. Carver, she paused. Carver is more complicated. He's insulated himself with enough legal architecture that a direct criminal action takes time. But Claire says that once the financial crime case moves against Victor, Carver's position becomes untenable in a way he'll understand before any warrant is issued. He'll be in his car headed north before breakfast. And the board? With the formal filing public, there's a record that contradicts any story Victor tries to run. His media contacts won't touch a story that has an active federal filing running counter to it. He could hear her organizing her thoughts as she talked, the same way she'd organized the details about Victor in his office the first morning she'd come to the garage. Sequentially, each piece connected to the next. The 2 uncertain board members will see which direction the wind is blowing. The 9 others will hold. He let out a slow breath of his own. When do you know for certain? Tomorrow. When the filings hit public record and the clock runs out for Victor to use what he thinks he has. She was quiet for a moment. Tonight is the night where we don't know yet. Tonight is always the night where you don't know yet, he said. She was quiet, and then she said, I used to hate that part. Used to? I'm working on something, she said, and he could hear the trace of something that wasn't quite humor but lived near it. He almost said something then. He felt it, the shape of something honest that wanted to come out, something about the nature of not knowing and how it changed depending on who you were not knowing alongside. He didn't say it. It wasn't the right moment for it, and he'd learned, in the years of raising a child alone and the years before that of operating in high-stakes environments, that most things that mattered could wait for the right moment without losing anything essential. Get some sleep, he said instead. I'll try. Sophia. Yes. He thought about what to say, landed on, You did good. The Amy Cho piece especially, that was the right call and you made it the right way. A pause. Thank you, she said, and she said it the same way he had earlier, plainly, because it was true, and it was what she had. He went inside, checked on Mia, deeply asleep, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, in the way she'd slept since she was small, as if she'd fallen into sleep mid-gesture and stayed exactly where she'd landed. He stood at her door for a moment, then he went to his room and lay down and did not expect to sleep. He slept. He woke at 6 to his phone buzzing. Not a call. A message from Marcus, short and plain. Carver checked out of the motel at 5:15 this morning, heading north. You were right about the timing. He lay there for a moment reading it and then typed back. Thanks for the help. Marcus responded, Buy a better lock for the garage, which was Marcus's version of stay safe, which was Marcus's version of anything that might sound like he cared, which Ethan had always known he did. He got up and made coffee and stood at the window, and the morning was gray and cold in the way of late November mornings on the coast, the light coming in sideways, the water somewhere behind the tree line, the color of old silver. At 7:30, Sophia called. The filings are public, she said. Victor's legal team contacted my board at 7 this morning to say he was initiating a response process, which is how attorneys say their client is scared. 2 of the media contacts he'd cultivated put out statements distancing themselves from unpublished material they'd received. She paused. It's over. Not immediately. Not cleanly. There'll be a legal process, and it'll take months and it'll cost money, but the attack is stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. You should be pleased, she said. This is the outcome you've been working toward. I know. You don't sound it. I do better with the process than the conclusion, he said. I always have. She seemed to consider this. That's actually not unusual for people built the way you are. He thought about asking what she meant by built the way you are and decided he understood well enough. Are you pleased? He asked. I am. I'm also... She stopped. I don't know. I expected to feel like I'd won. It doesn't feel like winning exactly. Because Victor didn't make a mistake. You outmaneuvered him. Those are different. What's the difference? When someone makes a mistake, you get to feel like the better version of what they are. When you outmaneuver them, he paused, looking for the right way to say it. You just feel like yourself. Another of her pauses, the kind he'd learned to read as actual thinking rather than performed consideration. That might be enough, she said. It usually is. Mia came downstairs in her pajamas at 7:52, hair pointing in 4 directions, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at him on the phone and raised her eyebrows in a question. He held up one finger. 1 minute. She went to the cabinet and got her cereal and sat at the table with the patience of someone who had learned that her father sometimes needed a minute. I have to go, he told Sophia. Mia. Of course. A pause. Ethan. I'd like to have that dinner. The one you said wasn't necessary 2 weeks ago. I think it might be necessary now. He looked at his daughter pouring cereal with one hand and reading the back of the box with the other, her hair completely unconquered, the morning light on the kitchen table, and the stack of ocean books beside the salt shaker. Thursday, he said. There's a place on the harbor that's decent. I know it. 7 o'clock? 7. He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and sat down across from Mia and poured himself a cup of coffee from the carafe he noticed, already taken out of the machine for him. She didn't look up from the cereal box. The thing is done. Mostly. Good. She turned the box over to look at a different panel. You seem like yourself again. He looked at her. Was I not? You were you, just a different gear of you. She finally looked up, the frankness of her gaze so familiar and so completely without guile that it was sometimes the most stabilizing thing in his world. I like this gear better, for regular days. Me too, he said. She went back to the cereal box. He drank his coffee. The morning light moved across the table as the clouds shifted, and outside the bare tree at the corner of the yard did something small and unhurried in the wind, and the day continued in the uncomplicated way of days that don't require more than what they are. And then, because these things don't end cleanly, because people like Victor Hale do not stop when they are thwarted, only redirect. Ethan's phone rang again at 8:47 while he was in the garage opening the bay doors, and the number was one he didn't recognize. And when he answered it, the voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried in the way of a man who has had a lot of practice sounding calm in circumstances where he is not. Mr. Vale, said Victor Hale, I think it's time we talk directly. I know everything about you, and I know everything about what happened the night your team didn't come home. I wonder how the people of Blackridge would feel about that story. I wonder how your daughter would feel, hearing a version of it from someone who isn't you. A pause, precisely timed. There's a way through this that doesn't cost either of us too much. Come to the warehouse tonight at 9, just you. We'll have a conversation. The line went dead. Ethan stood in the open bay door with the phone in his hand and the cold morning air coming through. He looked at the dark grease stain on the concrete where he'd been working the night before. He looked at the hand-stenciled sign above the door. He was aware that what had just happened was not a complication to the plan they'd executed. It was a separate problem, and it was the kind of problem that had his daughter's name in it, and Victor Hale's voice, and a warehouse, and the particular weight of a past that he had never been able to outrun completely. No matter how far he'd driven, or how many years he'd built something careful and quiet over the top of it. He put the phone in his pocket. He went back into the office and sat down and thought about the night his team hadn't come home, and what it meant that Victor knew about it, and what a man with nothing left to lose was capable of when the legal ground had been cut out from under him. And then he picked up the phone and called Sophia, because that was the difference, not between before and after Blackridge, not between the person he'd been and the person he'd become. The difference was that he wasn't alone in this anymore, and he was not going to pretend otherwise just because pretending otherwise had been what he knew how to do for a very long time. She picked up on the first ring. Victor called me, he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Tell me, she said. He told her. Sophia was quiet for long enough that Ethan could hear the ambient sound of wherever she was. The B&B, he thought, the creak of the old building settling in the morning cold. He has information about the mission, she said. It wasn't a question. He has something, enough to frame a story. Whether he has the actual classified details or just the shape of what happened, Ethan paused. It doesn't matter. The shape is enough to hurt. Hurt you or hurt Mia? He appreciated that she went directly to the real question. Both, but Mia is the leverage. That's why he said her name. Another silence, shorter this time. He wants you to come to the warehouse alone because he thinks you'll come to the warehouse alone. Because protecting her is the one thing he believes he can use to make you predictable. He's right that I'll come, Ethan said. He's wrong about the alone part. I'm coming. Sophia, I'm coming, Ethan. This started because of my project and my history with Victor. I'm not going to let you walk into that building while I sit at a desk. Her voice was even, not heated. The particular evenness of someone who has already made the decision and is informing you of it rather than asking. And before you explain to me the various ways this could go badly, I want you to know that I have spent the last 2 weeks learning how to be actually steady instead of performing it, and I would like the opportunity to demonstrate the difference. He stood in the office doorway looking out at the empty bay. The morning light was thin and flat. You know what he's going to try to do. He's going to try to make you feel like your past makes you dangerous and unreliable, and like the people around you would be better off not knowing you. She said it with a quietness that had no performance in it. He's going to try to make you feel like you should have stayed hidden. I know because it's the same thing he tried to do to me. Make me believe the foundation I built on wasn't real, that I was only what someone else said I was. A breath. It didn't work on me. It won't work on you. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was something about being known, actually known, in the specific, uncomfortable way of someone who has watched you operate under real pressure and drawn accurate conclusions, that he had spent a long time avoiding. He told himself the avoidance was about protecting Mia. It was also about this, the exposure of being seen clearly. I need to know Mia is somewhere safe tonight, he said. I'll arrange it. Who do you trust in this town? He thought about it. June Hartley. She's got 2 kids, a dog, and the disposition of someone who treats surprises as logistics problems. Mia likes her. I'll call her. Tell her Mia needs a sleepover for reasons you'll explain later. June seems like the kind of person who'll accept that. She is. What time? I'll drop Mia at June's at 7. Then I'll come to the warehouse. He thought about the layout. He'd walked it multiple times during site visits, knew where the sight lines were and where they weren't. You come from the north entry, not the main door. There's a loading access on the north side that's been unlocked since the drainage inspection last week. Victor won't know about it. How do you know he won't have people on it? I don't. But the north entry is the one Carver's people used when they were photographing the drainage infrastructure, and Carver is gone, which means anyone Victor's brought with him is working from a layout they haven't walked personally. He paused. I'll be inside before you. If it's not safe for you to come in, I'll text you a single word, library, and you call Claire Ashworth and stay outside. And if you don't text? Then it's manageable and I need you inside. He thought about what he was asking her to do and felt the familiar conflict of it. The trained instinct that said keep civilians out of operational spaces, and the recognition that Sophia Lancaster was not, in any meaningful sense, a civilian in the way that word usually implied. Can you record? Discreetly? Reliable audio? Dara will have something to me within the hour. Good. Whatever Victor says in that building, we want it on record. That's your job. Not to confront him, not to engage, just to record everything from the north entry position until I tell you it's clear to come in. And when it's clear to come in, then you come in and we finish this together. He could hear her breathe. Okay, she said. Okay. He spent the rest of the morning working because the alternative was sitting with the waiting, and sitting with the waiting had never been something he did well and was not going to start being something he did well today. He finished the brake job on Tyler's car. He ate lunch standing over the workbench, a sandwich he made mechanically and tasted about half of. He called Marcus at 1 o'clock. Victor called me, he said. Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds, which for Marcus was a significant pause. He's panicking. He's dangerous when he panics. He's got information about the mission. How much? Enough to be a weapon. I don't know the source. I might. Another pause. There was a journalist who tried to do a story on your unit 3 years ago. Never published. The story got killed at the editorial level because the sourcing was thin, but the journalist had enough of the outline that he tried to sell what he had to a private intelligence broker in D.C. Victor has money and D.C. connections. If he went looking, he'd find the outline. Yes, not the details, not the classified operations, but the shape, the date, the fact that you were the only one who came home. Marcus said it plainly because that was the only way to say true things that were also terrible. He's going to use it to make you look like a man with something to hide. And in the context of a small town where people know you as the quiet mechanic, I know what it looks like. Ethan, you don't have to go to the warehouse. He has Mia's name in his mouth. I'm going. A silence. Then, you want backup? He thought about it. No, I want someone who knows where I am. That I can do. A pause. Be careful with the man's ego. Cornered men with fragile egos do things that strategy doesn't explain. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He ended the call. Put the phone on the bench. Looked at the whale drawing on the wall. Mia had taped a new one up last week. This one's showing a pod of humpbacks in a formation she'd labeled in her careful, slightly oversized handwriting. Migratory cluster, North Pacific, winter route. He left the garage at 5. Made dinner, real dinner, pasta, the kind that required actual attention and produced something Mia ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had learned that meals made from scratch tasted different from meals made from a box, even if she couldn't have articulated why. She ate and told him about a book her teacher had given her, a novel about a girl who wanted to be an oceanographer in the 1960s when women weren't supposed to want things like that. She said the book made her angry in a way that felt productive, which was a phrase she'd picked up somewhere and deployed with confidence. He listened and asked questions and did not think about the warehouse. At 6:45, he told her she was going to spend the night at June Hartley's. She looked at him across the table. Why? I have something to handle tonight. The Sophia thing. Yeah. She looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of her attention that was the most uncomfortable and most cherished feature of being her father. The attention that didn't perform acceptance but actually weighed things. Are you going to be okay? Yes. Promise? He thought about what he promised his daughter and what he didn't. He had never promised her things he wasn't certain of because she was old enough to understand what promises were, and he respected her enough to treat them as real. I'm going to be careful, he said, and I know what I'm doing. She seemed to evaluate this. It was not a promise, and they both knew it, but it was true, and true was what she'd gotten from him her whole life, and she understood the currency of it. Okay, she said. He drove her to June's at 7. June met them at the door in reading glasses with a book tucked under her arm, looked at Ethan's face with the calm, practical intelligence of a woman who had navigated enough of life to know when to ask questions and when to simply make room, and said, Mia, there's hot chocolate and Maya's been asking about your whale drawings all week. She's already got the good markers out. Mia gave Ethan a hug that lasted slightly longer than usual, which he took as her version of acknowledgement. She knew what tonight was, or enough of the shape of it, and she was letting him know she knew without saying it, which was both his best quality in her and the one that occasionally broke something open in his chest. He drove to the warehouse. He arrived at 8:30. The north side confirmed what he'd expected. The loading access was unlocked and there were no signs of anyone watching it. He sent Sophia a message with the confirmation. She responded, 10 minutes out, audio device active. He went in through the main door. The warehouse at night was a different space than it had been during daylight site visits. The industrial corridor of old equipment and vacant processing bays had a quality of abandoned intention. Things built for a specific purpose, now empty of it, the structure remaining after the reason for the structure was gone. He knew this quality from other contexts. He found a position in the shadow of a support column, 40 feet from the center of the main floor, and waited. Victor Hale arrived at 8:58. He came in through the main entrance with 2 men, which Ethan had expected. The men were not the same type as the first 3, not young muscle for hire, older, harder, the kind that moved with a professional quality. Not military, but trained in some framework. Private security, probably. Victor had upgraded. Victor himself was not what Ethan had constructed in his imagination, which was always the way. Imagination made monsters and reality produced people. And people were both more ordinary and more troubling than monsters. He was 50 or so, fit in the maintained way of wealthy men who had personal trainers and time for it, silver at the temples, dressed in a dark coat that was expensive without being conspicuous. He had a face that had probably been charming when he was younger and had settled over time into something that was precise and controlled and slightly too aware of itself. He saw Ethan at the column and stopped walking. His men fanned out slightly, reading the space. You came alone, Victor said. That's what you asked for. It is. He walked closer, not all the way, stopping about 20 feet out. I appreciate that. I think direct conversations are underrated. Ethan said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was a better response than filling space, because it made the other person fill it instead, and what people chose to fill silence with was frequently more useful than anything you could ask them. Victor recognized the technique, which was interesting. It meant he'd dealt with people who used it before. He smiled slightly. Your former Navy SEAL, Team 9, Classified Operations 2014 through 2019, correct? You've done your research. I'm careful. He took another step. I know about Kandahar. I know about the date. I know you were the only member of your fire team who came home. He paused, watching Ethan's face. I know you've never talked about it publicly. I know the people in this town don't know that version of your history. What's your point, Victor? He seemed slightly put off by the use of his first name, which was a small but useful piece of information. My point is that people are afraid of things they don't understand. And a quiet mechanic who turns out to have a classified history where 3 of his colleagues died. He let the sentence shape itself without finishing it. People in small towns build stories about that. You'd plant a story. I'd make information available. The rest happens naturally. He tilted his head. All you have to do is step back from Sophia's project. Tell her you're not able to continue your involvement. I have no interest in you personally. You're a complication, not a target. Remove the complication and this conversation stays private. Ethan looked at him. He was aware of the north entrance 60 feet to his left, where Sophia was presumably in position. He was aware of the 2 men, their positioning, the distance between them. He was also aware that this conversation was being recorded, which meant every word Victor said was going somewhere that Victor didn't know about. Let me ask you something, Ethan said. Victor waited. You've spent 18 months building something against Sophia's company. You've paid people to lie, planted false documents, sent men to frighten a woman in a dark building, bought off a 26-year-old in debt. And now you're here threatening to weaponize a classified tragedy to pressure someone who helped Sophia and doesn't work for you and has never done anything to you. He said it without heat, just laying it out in sequence. What's the actual goal? Because it's not the company anymore. The legal case is already moving. You know that. Something moved in Victor's face, just briefly. This is about what I built. You didn't build Lancaster Tech. I built the foundation. You contributed to the foundation. Then you tried to take it somewhere Sophia wouldn't go, and she bought you out at a price you agreed to, and you couldn't accept that the company succeeded without you because you needed it to be yours. Ethan let that sit for a second. This isn't about the company. It hasn't been about the company for a long time. It's about not being able to live with the fact that she was right. Victor's jaw tightened. You don't know what I built. I know what you burned down trying to prove a point. He stepped away from the column, not toward Victor, just out into the open, visible. The legal filings are public. The financial crimes documentation is on record. The transfers to Amy Cho are documented. Whatever story you try to run about me or about Sophia, it runs against a public record that already exists. He paused. You came here because you needed one last piece of leverage and you thought I'd hand it to you. I'm telling you there is no piece of leverage. It's done. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The 2 men behind him were still, reading the situation, waiting for a signal. The signal didn't come because Victor was smart enough to understand what Ethan was telling him, even if he didn't want to accept it, and smart enough to know that the 2 men behind him were a practical resource and not a solution to the problem he was actually facing. The things that happened to your team, Victor said, and his voice had shifted. Still controlled, but the smooth certainty was gone, replaced by something that was trying to be menacing and was actually just tired. The questions people would ask. About leadership decisions. About whether the only man who came home made the right calls. Ask them, Ethan said. Victor blinked. Ask every question you want to ask. I've asked them myself every day for 7 years. He said it quietly, without drama. Go ahead and make the information available. Run the story. Tell the town. Tell anyone who'll listen. He felt the weight of what he was saying as he said it. Felt it in the way of something that had been held for a long time beginning to be set down. I will answer every question honestly, and the people who know me will decide what they think, and I will live with that because I have lived with the real version of it for 7 years, and I am still standing here. The warehouse was quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, the water moved against the coast. You don't have anything, Ethan said. You never had anything. You had a story about a man's worst year and you thought you could use it against him. But that's not leverage. That's just a wound. And wounds don't belong to the people who find them. He heard footsteps from the north. Not rushed. Steady. The particular cadence of someone who had decided to move. Sophia walked in from the loading access. She walked across the warehouse floor with the same qualities she'd had the first night he'd seen her in the dark. No performance of courage, just the actual thing, which looks quieter than people expect. She was wearing her wool coat. She had her phone in her hand, the recording application visible on the screen. She stopped beside Ethan. Victor looked at her. Something moved across his face that was complicated. Surprise. And beneath it something that might have been, in another kind of person, shame. Sophia, he said, Victor. She held up the phone. Everything you've said in the last 15 minutes is recorded on a device that's simultaneously backed up to 3 separate locations. Claire Ashworth's office received a copy 7 minutes ago. The 2 men behind Victor exchanged a look. One of them shifted his weight backward, the small involuntary movement of someone recalculating whether they want to be in a room. You planned this, Victor said. You planned a meeting at a warehouse and told Ethan to come alone, Sophia said. What exactly did you think was going to happen? You thought he'd be isolated. You thought the threat about his past would frighten him into compliance because you believe everyone has a breaking point, and the breaking point is always the thing they're most afraid of losing. She looked at Victor with an expression that wasn't angry, which was worse than anger for a man like Victor. It was clear-eyed and unsurprised. You've never understood that there are people who have already faced the worst version of their loss and come out the other side. You can't threaten someone with a thing they've already survived. Victor said nothing. The recording will be part of Claire's filing. The threat to weaponize classified military information for personal and commercial leverage is a separate legal matter from the financial crimes case, and Claire has already been briefed on it. She lowered the phone. Your attorneys are going to have a very busy month. One of the 2 men behind Victor spoke quietly. Mr. Hale, we should go. Victor stood there for another moment. Ethan watched his face, watched the calculation running behind the eyes, the same calculation that men in difficult positions always ran when the variables stopped adding up, looking for the angle that didn't exist. Then something in him settled. Not acceptance exactly. Men like Victor didn't arrive at acceptance quickly. More like the physical acknowledgement of a locked door. He straightened his coat, looked at Ethan. You really don't care what people know about you, he said. It came out less like an accusation and more like a thing he was genuinely trying to understand. I care, Ethan said. I just care about the right things more. Victor held his gaze for another second, then looked away, which was the only answer that mattered. He left. His 2 men followed. The main door closed. The warehouse was quiet. Ethan and Sophia stood in the large empty space with the distant sound of the water and the cold that came through the old walls, and the particular feeling that arrives after something that required a great deal of tension has simply stopped requiring it. Sophia exhaled, a long, slow release that was nothing like the composed exhales she produced in public. This was the real one, the one that had been waiting. You said you'd text me library if it wasn't safe, she said. It was manageable. It really wasn't for the first several minutes. It was going to be. She looked at him. How were you sure? I wasn't. He looked at the door where Victor had gone. I was ready for it not to be. That's different. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What you said to him. About the questions. About answering them. She paused. You meant that. Yeah. That wasn't strategy. No. She looked at him with the clear attention that he had come to understand was her most honest mode. The one that wasn't managing anything or performing anything, just looking. Have you ever actually talked about it? What happened? Not to anyone who wasn't in a uniform and reading a report. Do you want to? He thought about it. He thought about 7 years of silence on the subject, and Mia asleep down the hall on Meridian Street without knowing the full version of her father's history, and the small town that knew him as Vale Auto, and the creak on the second-to-last porch step, and a man who fixed things and told the truth about what they cost. Maybe, he said. Not tonight. Not tonight, she agreed. They walked out through the north loading access, his choice because habits of exit ran deep, and into the cold night air of the industrial site, the same ground where he'd first stepped into her situation 3 weeks ago in a canvas jacket with a grease stain on the left forearm. He thought about that night, how he'd almost gone straight home, how he'd told himself he was walking the perimeter out of habit, and not because some part of him had been paying attention to this woman making site visits alone for 3 days, and understood, in a background way, that she was moving without adequate awareness of what was paying attention back. He was not, in general, a man who believed things happened for reasons. Life was physics, mostly. Objects in motion, accumulated forces, occasional luck. But he also knew that 3 weeks ago he'd been a man who had finished constructing a life around a carefully maintained distance from anything that might require him to be fully known, and something in him had already been tired of it, and he'd just been waiting for a circumstance large enough to make the tiredness undeniable. This had been that circumstance. Sophia Lancaster in a dark building, surrounded, and his feet already moving before his mind had properly authorized the decision. They stopped at her car. "Thursday," she said. "Dinner, 7 o'clock. "Still yes." She nodded. The cold had put color in her face. She looked, he thought, less like a cover of a magazine than she'd looked when she arrived in Blackridge. Not worse, just more human, inhabited by whatever the last 3 weeks had put her through. "Ethan." She said his name the same way she always did, directly, no cushion around it. "The things you said in there, about wounds not belonging to the people who find them." She paused. "I'm going to remember that for a long time." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said what was true. "It's yours, if it's useful." She got in the car, and he watched the headlights move out of the old industrial lot and turn south toward the harbor and disappear. He drove to June's to pick up Mia. June met him at the door and said only, "She's fine. They wore each other out talking about fish for 2 hours and she's been asleep since 9. She looked at him with the practical kindness of someone who has decided not to ask and means it. "She can stay. You look like you need a quiet house." "I'll take her home," he said. He carried Mia to the truck. She was heavy in the specific way of sleeping children, complete dead weight, completely trusting, and buckled her in and drove home on Meridian Street. And she didn't wake up, and the night was cold and clear in a way that the last several weeks had not been. The cloud cover finally breaking, stars doing what stars did over a coast when there was nothing between them and you. He got her inside and into bed and stood at her door for a moment in the dark. She stirred. "Dad." "Yeah." "Is it okay?" "It's okay." A pause, and then the sound of her settling back into sleep, and then quiet. He went to the kitchen and made tea he didn't want for the second time in recent memory, and sat at the table with Mia's ocean books and the drawing of the migratory cluster taped to the cabinet door. And he thought about what it meant that for the first time in 7 years someone had asked him if he'd ever talked about it, and he'd said maybe, and it hadn't felt like a collapse. It had felt like a door he'd been standing in front of for a long time deciding whether to open. He wasn't ready to open it tonight, but he knew where the door was now. He knew someone who would be on the other side of it, patient and unperforming, when he got there. That was more than he'd had last month, and last month had been fine. This was different from fine. The weeks that followed had the quality of things resolving not dramatically but genuinely, the way real resolutions happen, slowly, with paperwork, with conversations that needed to be had, with the occasional setback that required adjustment. Claire Ashworth's case moved. Victor Hale's legal team entered into negotiations that Victor had clearly not anticipated wanting to enter. The financial crimes case produced, in its methodical way, a record that was far more damaging to Victor than any story he could have run about Sophia or Ethan, because it was true and documented and public. Amy Cho was not charged. She cooperated fully, and Claire's filing noted her cooperation in terms that protected her position. She called Sophia once, on a Thursday evening, to say thank you. Sophia told her she'd given them exactly what they needed, which was the truth, and recommended her for a position with the Regional Planning Authority that had come open and that Sophia had absolutely nothing to do with arranging, except for a single conversation with someone she knew on the hiring committee. Carver did not resurface in Blackridge or, as far as Marcus could determine, in any context that touched Lancaster Tech or Sophia's interests. Men like Carver were practical in the final accounting, and the practical calculation was clear. The Blackridge project moved forward with the energy of something that had been tested and held. The planning approvals came through in January. The first development contracts were signed in February. June Hartley, who had been quietly watching everything with the comprehensive attention of a woman who ran a small business association and understood that the details of what people said and did in a town were the actual history of that town, organized a community meeting in the third week of February where 63 people showed up and talked about what they wanted the industrial site to become. Ethan went to the meeting. He sat in the back and didn't say much. Sophia sat at the front and said everything that needed saying and listened to the things she hadn't known to say. Mia went and asked 4 questions about whether the planned educational facility would have any programming around marine science. which produced a conversation between her and a retired biology teacher named Carl, who had once worked at a coastal research station, and which resulted in Carl agreeing to run an after-school program on coastal ecosystems if the facilities were built to include a wet lab. Ethan watched his daughter talking to Carl, the animation in her face, the way she used her hands when she was excited, the particular intensity of someone who had found a person who knew the same language she did, and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Pride was part of it. Gratitude was part of it. Something else underneath those that had to do with the specific relief of watching someone you love becoming who they are going to be, and seeing that it's good. He drove home that night with Mia in the passenger seat, talking without stopping about wet labs and tidal ecosystems, and pulled into Meridian Street and sat in the truck in the driveway after she went inside, the engine cooling, the stars clear overhead, the porch light making its small yellow circle on the dead grass of late February. He thought about the things he'd carried for a long time. The weight of Kandahar, which was what he allowed himself to call it in his own mind now rather than the shapes and temperatures he'd used before, as if naming it had become possible, finally, after he'd said ask them in a cold warehouse and survived the saying of it. The weight of the careful life. The weight of being known only as far as he permitted. He'd started talking to a therapist in January. Not because Sophia had suggested it, she hadn't, but because he'd made a decision in the quiet of a Tuesday morning that the door he'd been standing in front of might open more cleanly with some help, and that asking for help with the things he couldn't carry alone was not the same as weakness, however much he'd trained himself to treat it that way. It was hard. It was useful. It was both of those things at once, which he'd found to be true of most things that actually mattered. He and Sophia had dinner on Thursday, and then again the following week. The week after that he cooked, at the Meridian Street house, which Mia had insisted on and which produced an evening where Sophia sat at the small kitchen table and ate pasta and listened to a 45-minute explanation of blue whale migration patterns delivered by an 8-year-old with a hand-drawn map, and responded with questions that were genuine enough that Mia put her fork down twice because she needed both hands to gesture properly. He watched them across the table and thought, this is what I didn't let myself have for a long time. Not this specific thing. He hadn't known this specific thing was possible, just the general category of it. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of people around a table who meant something to each other, not performing meaning but actually having it. It was imperfect in all the ways that real things are imperfect. Sophia had a company that required her in ways that didn't bend to convenience. He had a child and a business and a history that were not simple. There were evenings that didn't work, and conversations that got tangled, and at least one argument in early March about something that was ostensibly about logistics, and was actually about the older and harder question of what people owed each other when they decided to stop being careful. They worked it out, not cleanly, but genuinely. In April, at the groundbreaking ceremony for the first phase of the Black Ridge development, Sophia stood at a podium in front of about 140 people, townspeople, officials, some press, and spoke about the project in the way she spoke about things she actually cared about, which was directly and without the kind of inspirational language that sounded good and meant nothing. She talked about what Blackridge had and what it needed and what this development was and wasn't. She talked about the people she'd met, named June, named Carl, named 3 local contractors who'd been brought into the development team. She talked about the 14 acres of vacant land and the 11 years it had sat unused and what it cost a community to carry that much vacancy for that long. And then she said one more thing. She said that the person who had most shaped how she thought about the project and about what it should be for was someone who had spent 7 years fixing things in this town quietly, without recognition, and who understood better than anyone she'd ever met that the value of a place is not in its economy or its infrastructure, but in what the people who live there are willing to stand up for. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. He was standing at the back of the crowd with Mia beside him and her hand in his, and he felt the words land in the particular way that things land when they're true and given freely and not asked for. Mia looked up at him. "That's you," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Are you okay?" He thought about what okay meant and how it differed from fine and how both of those differed from whatever this was. This standing in a crowd in April with his daughter's hand in his and the sound of the water somewhere beyond the buildings and the specific knowledge that the things he'd carried for a long time were still there, would probably always be there, but had been joined by other things now, things that had weight of a different kind. "I'm good," he said. She seemed to accept this as the more complete answer it was. The ceremony ended. People talked and shook hands, and the local news recorded things that would play briefly and be forgotten, and that mattered anyway. June organized coffee, and someone brought pastries. Carl found Mia immediately and showed her something on his phone that produced a reaction Ethan could see from 15 feet away. Sophia found him at the edge of the crowd. She stood beside him and looked at the site. The cranes already in position, the cleared ground that had been a vacant industrial corridor for 11 years now, beginning to become something else. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like the beginning of a lot of work," she said. "Yeah." "Good work." "Yeah." She looked at him. "You've been in Blackridge for 7 years. About that. Are you going to stay?" He looked at the site, at June talking to a council member, at Carl and Mia with the phone, at the cranes against the April sky, the water just visible between the buildings, silver and present and ongoing. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to stay." She nodded, looking forward again. Her shoulder was close to his. The April air had the particular quality of a coast leaving winter behind, not warmly, not gradually, but with the blunt fact of a season changing because it was time. He thought about the man who'd driven into Blackridge 7 years ago with a duffel bag and a car seat and 3 months' rent in cash, looking for a place that didn't ask too many questions. He thought about what he'd been building all that time and how it had turned out to be both exactly what he'd intended and considerably more than he'd planned. The things that mattered were not the things he'd expected to matter. The things that held were not the things he'd tried to protect most carefully. The life that turned out to be real was not the quiet, contained, carefully managed one he'd constructed. Or it wasn't only that. It was also this: the groundbreaking and the crowd in his daughter's hand and the woman beside him and the work that was beginning where the vacancy had been. He had not known any of it was coming. He had simply stayed and been present. And when the moment came, not walked away. That turned out to be enough. That turned out